Hi, everyone, and welcome to this session of the Comics Lair, where we'll discuss Magnus, the robot fighter of the 41st century. The Comics Lair is sponsored by Heroes Aren't Hard to Find and Heroes Convention. I'm your host, Nancy Northcott. I'd like to start by asking our guests to introduce themselves, tell us a little about themselves, and how they first became interested in Magnus. Alex, will you start?
Oh, certainly. Hi there, everybody. I'm Alex Simmons. I'm fairly well known as a freelance writer of a number of projects. I've worked on Batman, Archie, a number of independent projects of my own, Scooby-Doo, some other things like that. My character, Blackjack, which is an African-American soldier of fortune in the 1930s. I'm an Inkpot Award winner. I'm very happy and excited about that. And I have been in the comic book industry for years. I'm also a playwright, and I also teach screenwriting at the New York Film Academy. My affection for Magnus, a robot fighter, really started earlier in my life when I was much more of an avid comic book reader. So I would have to admit that was a while back, and that was with the Gold Key run, which was created. Actually, the character was created by Russ Manning. So it was that series that really sort of pulled me in. And I can only say that, it's interesting. That's a period where robots and cyborgs and the $6 Million Man, these sort of characters were coming to the forefront of television and a little bit of film. And it was very exciting. It's a whole new wave of science fiction that was really sort of titillating in a lot of ways. And to have a vision of a character who lived far in the future, who barehandedly could tackle robots and aliens, was kind of cool. And so that was part of the fun, but also the other end of the fun was because it was science fiction. And so there was a look at the future with all the excitement that a young person might envision what tomorrow might bring. So that was my initial take on the character. And I think I'll talk more about what I liked or what pulled me in as we get further into the story.
Okay, Fraser?
I'm Fraser Sherman. I write historical fantasy primarily and film reference books. I first encountered Magnus. British comic books have a long tradition. They come out weekly, and some of them supplement homegrown material with British comic books broken down into weekly chunks. I remember seeing Magnus' origin. I think it was in a comic book called TV21, though I can't swear to it. Thought it was okay. Didn't really appreciate Magnus until a few years ago when I got a trade paperback of the first Dark Horse issues and seen in color all the lovely Russ Manning art and getting to read a lot more of it than I had as a kid. Much more impressed.
Well, those who have been in the Comics Lair before know that I write historical fantasy for Falstaff Books. I also write several different genres of romance, and with Jeannie Adams, I write the Outcast Station science fiction series. I started reading comics when I was about 8, and I discovered Magnus somewhere in the next couple of years on a spinner rack. And I think this picture of this guy fighting robots got my attention. Most of my allowance at that time went to superheroes because that's when a comic book was 12 cents. And with 1 penny sales tax, you could buy 2 comic books with my 25 cents weekly allowance. And so mostly it went to superheroes. But I did occasionally buy books like Magnus or The Mighty Samson or other books from different companies. And I think what I liked about Magnus was it was kind of a nifty looking future. The good guy won, which is important. And the Russ Manning art was really appealing. And I know that Fraser and Alex are aware, but the viewing audience may not be aware that Manning died in 1981. And ever since then, there has been an award presented for the most promising newcomer at San Diego Comic-Con that's named for him. So he was pretty impressive all around. It's not just for Magnus that he got that award. So there are 3 Dark Horse Comics compilations of the Russ Manning run on Magnus. And the introduction to the third one was written by Keith Giffen. And this was some years ago. So we were just discussing this before we started filming. He said it shouldn't have worked. Think about it. He wore white go-go boots and a chainmail miniskirt and beat up robots. Face it, gang, it shouldn't have worked at all, but it did. So now we might look at the chainmail miniskirt and the white go-go boots and perceive it differently than people did in 1963 when the book first came out. But do you all agree with what Giffen said, and why or why not? And if you have any thoughts on the costume, please feel free to weigh in. Fraser?
I don't agree. I mean, Magnus is basically working with one of the classic themes, which is technology is useful, but it's a dangerous servant, particularly if you get up to the level of robots, artificial intelligence. And obviously, we're seeing some of that now. They're not in the form of killer robs. And you've got one man taking a stand, fighting against it, beautifully drawn, and, smashing robots. I think it is a perfectly workable concept. Plus, the whole idea, it's very much a vision of the future, peaceful, luxurious, the kind of future we used to dream about, where technology would let us all work maybe 2 or 3 hours a day. Then we could kick back and have fun. And it's very much in that mode. So, no, I think it makes perfect sense that it worked. After years of reading comics, his outfit just looks like a typical superhero suit, little unconventional, but no, I don't find anything strange in it. And that's me.
I'm sorry, what?
But that's me.
Okay. Alex?
Yeah, when I first saw the outfit, I don't remember having any kind of reaction like, oh, that's weird. It like Fraser's saying, it was a costume. And so I accepted it as this costume. Also with the bulging muscles and the fact that he was karate chopping his way through solid metal, and these things, it was very impressive on that level. I have to say that there were a couple of occasions, because we're talking, I think these came out in the 1960s.
1963 was the first issue.
Well, there was something else, and it's funny, Fraser, you should be on this particular show. There was another experience I was having with media at that time. I had been watching television one evening, looking for something, different and exciting to watch. And I was going through something called TV Guide. We don't have that anymore, but it used to be TV Guide. And I see coming on at 10 o'clock at night on ABC here in New York was a show called The Avengers. And I'm thinking, oh, great. Captain America and all these other guys are going to be on television at 10 o'clock at night. I'm going to watch that. And instead, it was these two British characters, a male and female, John Steed with the bowler hat and very dapper and an umbrella, and Emma Peel. I started with the Emma Peel version of the series, played by Diana Rigg. And they were the Avengers. And when you watch them, they were spies in a way. Sort of agents of the British government who took on very bizarre, sort of campy kind of cases and things. It was a fun show. But the thing that made me think about Magnus and that is that when Diana Rigg, one of the lead characters, would get into a fight, she would be karate chopping the bad guys in very much the way that you can see some of the drawings that Russ had Magnus plowing through some of the robots. So every now and then I just made this connection that obviously all of karate is this blow. If I could master this blow, I'm good. Any fight, anything, I got him. So that was sort of my take. But as I said, Magnus to me in the outfit at that time, it didn't seem strange to me. Of course, with years and, looking at things in different perceptions and being of a different age and some of the things that are going on now, I can look at it now and I can see, I can see where this might have conjured up other images in other people's minds at the same time I was being introduced to it. And certainly there are thoughts that one could have now. I think I showed you an image a little while ago. Can I do that again? Can I?
I think so, because you're still.
I'm just going to the image of Magnus that. Yeah, it's this one. I'm not sure how well this is showing up. But here's this one. So here's the outfit. And Nancy, you had said that from a rear view, it looks more like short pants. But here, yeah, I could see where one might think this is a skirt. And here are the white boots. So in some respects, this image back in the 1960s, early 70s is total superhero. Look at these. He's taking on these robots. He's decking them. He's got it all under control. And then at the same time, I can look at him now and going, I could see a different kind of audience appeal here and a different kind of market direction that one could go with this series. Yeah. So who knows what's possible as we talk about the past, accomplishments of the series, what's possible with another approach?
Yeah. Well, Legia Klein also wore white go-go boots, but her white go-go boots were shorter. They didn't come up as high as Magnus's. And, I never thought about it until Fraser said, but it really is like a conventional superhero suit minus the tights.
Yeah.
Really, it's really kind of a little tunic. And, as I often have issues with superhero suits, but there's no way those little flaps over his arms stay in place when he's swinging around and punching people. I don't think people should wear turtle shells on their shoulders either, and that's correct.
Like Spider-Man costumes that we see in the films now, there's some techno involved there that keeps it locked in its proper position. Maybe there's a little, biokinetic thing going on there that we're not aware of, that Russ didn't bother to explain.
Yeah. Oh, and just a note for viewers who may not be familiar with Magnus. The original series, Magnus Robot Fighter 4000 AD, was published by Gold Key Comics between 1963 and 1968. And then there were issues that appeared sporadically up until about 1977. And then Dark Horse published a 3-issue compilation that is not complete. It's selected issues. And Magnus was also published in Germany and for a while appeared on occasion in a Mexican comic. So he had broader appeal than I think I, as an 8-year-old buying things off the spinner rack, figured that he would. Russ Manning, who created Magnus. I'm sorry, Fraser, did you want to say something?
It was something that Alexander talking about Emma Peel made me think of, and I think it's relevant to Magnus. Martial arts in the 60s, karate and judo, they were treated sort of like ninjutsu would be a couple of decades later. It was virtually a superpower in itself. In Marvel Comics, you're always having Captain America, no matter how big or how powerful, I will use judo and turn your own strength against you. Wham, guy goes into the wall and down. There were a couple of early Marvel comic books that stayed a perfectly ordinary human black belt can cut steel with a karate chop. So Magnus is not out of line with what at least some people vaguely imagine karate was like.
Well, and Magnus was given the equivalent of super strength with his training from
Good point. 1A. Yes.
But I thought what Alex was saying about Emma Peel and the karate chops was interesting because, as so many of us are aware, Yvonne Craig wasn't allowed to punch anybody as Batgirl. Which is, I guess,
danced around the fight scene. Yeah.
Yes.
People. Yeah.
Well, Russ Manning described Magnus as a futuristic Tarzan, but with robots instead of apes as his enemies. Do you agree or disagree with that description, Alex?
Well, it's hard to argue with the creator. I mean, I think what you just read was his concept. It was his concept, his creation. So that is how he saw it. And I would say, yeah, okay, Russ, that's what you felt you created. When I was looking at it, again, the 60s into the 70s, you had, and for people now, I don't know, especially younger people listening to this now, you have to try and imagine that we came out of the 50s. And so we came out of, quote unquote, the introduction of the atomic age. The atom bomb, the atomic bomb had been dropped, and horrible things had come from that. But also now we were being promised a magnificent nuclear future because nuclear power is going to make everything better. Then suddenly there was this thing, Flash Gordon and some of these other characters had ray guns, and you could imagine what a ray gun would be. But then suddenly someone came up with a thing called a laser. So wait a minute, you mean there could be a real ray gun? Sure, if you had a ruby red quartz crystal and certain other technical skills, you could build one. I tried. It didn't work. But the reality was that the future was promising to be as fantastic as the comics and the sci-fi movies had promised. And so when you looked at Magnus, I wasn't thinking Tarzan. I wasn't thinking, and I read Tarzan and things like that. I wasn't thinking the past and a variation on it. I was really looking at, wow, yeah, if we have robots that can do this, this, and this, in the future, they could become a threat, or they could be used in certain ways that would be bad. And yeah, you would need to have someone who is skilled to do X, Y, and Z. And so it becomes sort of it's sort of taking the trope of the hero who's trained to save society and applying it to this particular world, this particular arena. So for me, it wasn't Tarzan. I was seeing, I don't know, Buck Rogers. I was seeing Flash Gordon. I was seeing Tommy Tomorrow. I was seeing comic book characters and fantasies that projected forward and took me off the planet, even though these stories did take place on Earth.
Okay, Fraser?
I can sort of see, this would be my guess, that he's Tarzan in the sense that he is a noble savage. He comes from outside civilization, where everyone in NORAM, which is futuristic North America, is accustomed to relying on robots and helpless without them. He stands strong. Magnus can go it alone. But that said, it would never in a million years occur to me to equate him to Tarzan if Russ Manning hadn't said it. Like Alexander, I think of him as much more in the futuristic Flash Gordon mode than Tarzan.
Well, it never would have occurred to me either. But at that time, Manning was drawing Korak, son of Tarzan, and some Tarzan for Gold Key. So maybe that's kind of like this is Wagon Train to the Stars for Star Trek. He's relating it to something that he's already doing. But to me, it was more like Legion of Superheroes, except it's not a team book, and he has extraordinary abilities. But he doesn't have the kinds of abilities we normally associate with superheroes.
Wasn't there a Legion of Superheroes character called Karate Kid?
Yes.
Yes.
Introduced in the 60s, he could also chop through steel.
Yes, he did. And he stayed on his feet against Superboy for about 30 seconds. And so...
pretty good.
Yeah, based on that, Superboy said, anybody who can put up a tussle like that against me belongs in the Legion. So maybe we could extrapolate from that Magnus could join the Legion had he been in the same universe at the same time.
Heck yes.
But, a lot of heroes have sidekicks. And as Fraser said, Magnus kind of goes it alone. The closest he has to a sidekick is Legia Klein, who's the daughter of a senator. I wasn't really able to determine what she does other than be the daughter of a senator.
His girlfriend.
Yeah. Although that was kind of sporadic, and sometimes it didn't matter and sometimes it did. But I'm wondering how you all would briefly describe Legia. Fraser, will you start?
He's redheaded and very sexy. That is the first thing that I think of. Russ Manning draws really attractive women. She is brave, and if push comes to shove, she will help Magnus in any way she can. She is still not a dynamic female character by today's standards, by a long shot. She's much more in the classic 60s girlfriend mode. She reminds me a little of Betty Ross from the Hulk, in the sense that Betty Ross was General Ross's daughter, and she didn't do anything else either, which was more normal back then. There were a lot of women who would still stay with their parents until it was time to get married. So it probably did not seem as strange as it does now looking back.
Okay. Alex?
Well, I would agree with Fraser, and I would also add to that, she has a little bit at times of a Margot Lane feel to her, as in, again, the way the character was handled in the original books, the pulp issues, not so much the radio show. So The Shadow, by the way, in case anybody doesn't know what I'm talking about, Margot Lane was Lamont Cranston's was his quote unquote friend, but the way they discussed it was more like a girlfriend. He was constantly dating her, but they really weren't very romantic on the show. But in the pulps, Margot was an aide to the Shadow. They weren't involved romantically, but she would get assignments and she would do certain things. She was not necessarily into the fighting and the shooting, but she would go undercover and things like that. I feel that to some degree that Legia was used in that way when the writer found it convenient, and that's really kind of the way it felt like she was utilized. Oh, here's a spot where I could use Legia. Here's something that Legia could say. But I never really felt like she was an integral part of the storyline. And again, as a kid, the younger, earlier period that I was reading the comics, I didn't miss that. But again, as a fan of going back to the Avengers, the TV series, one of the things I enjoyed about the TV series is when Steed and Emma would go out on their various investigations, she was equal to him. She would go do her part, he would go do his. If they wound up in danger, one would save the other. They'd fight alongside each other, So there was at times in my experience of media and entertainment, there were strong female characters who could hold their own. Legia wasn't utilized that way, and I think it's because of, and I'm not pointing fingers at Russ and saying you're bad, but I don't think it was the way he saw her, and I think subsequently certain other writers who took on the project, pardon me, didn't see her that way either.
Well, when I was 8 years old and read these books, I was just glad there was a female character who was prominent a lot in the story, because there weren't a lot of them in 1963. And honestly, as frivolous as it feels to look back on it, I wanted her hair and I wanted her dress with the kind of sheer, frothy, not really frothy, but I don't even know what to call it. Gauzy, I guess it is.
Translucent?
Hey, pardon?
Translucent?
Yes, that's a good word for it. And so I liked that about Legia. Looking back at those stories, getting ready for this panel, she gets taken hostage a lot. She runs in frequently after Magnus has said, stay here where it's safe. Like at one point, she was supposed to be watching a couple of evil robots that were tools of the villain. And she was so worried about Magnus, she just left them unguarded and ran to see what was going on with Magnus. And I thought, too stupid to live here, maybe. But then at other times, she rescued Magnus. So I think I would describe the character as uneven, because sometimes she was very helpful and sometimes not. And part of that for me was she started training with the people in the first couple of issues who had been kidnapped to power a robot planet. I don't know if y'all remember that. And so they were working as one collective mind, 1,000 people. Yes. They'd sort of developed a form of telepathy. And so we find into the series that one of them has been training Legia to use, I guess, what must have been latent telepathic ability in all humans based on the way they used it. But then again, sometimes she had telepathy and sometimes she didn't. Like, do you all have any thoughts about that? Or have you said what you wanted to say?
No, there's more I could say, but please, you go first, sir.
What I'd have to say, anything that makes her more effective and gives her a bigger role is a plus. Certainly reading now, it probably wouldn't have troubled me at the time. Inconsistency and that sort of thing was a hobgoblin with a lot of 60s creators. They were trying to get out as much stuff as possible just so they could get paid and meet their deadlines. So even in Stanley and Kirby, you can see where they are skipping a groove here and there because they have forgotten what they did in one of the 4 or 5 issues they did the previous month.
Yeah,
that's how it was.
I'm sorry.
Oh, that was it.
Oh, okay. I would also say that, she, in that way, she fit the sidekick role perfectly, because there are situations they did that with Robin, in the Batman stories. It's a matter, if you think about it, okay, I'm going to wear the dark clothing with the cape that helps me blend into the darkness in the alleys, in the warehouses, in the caves, anywhere where there's danger. You wear this bright yellow, cape and the flashy red stuff and run around in the light, so they'll see you and then I can come up behind them. And Robin would sometimes, Batman would say, don't do this, stay here, blah, blah, blah. And then Robin would go do the exact opposite and get trapped or whatever. So I think to that extent, sidekicks were foils because after all, the series is called Magnus Robot Fighter, not Magnus and Legia Robot Fighters. It is called Batman and Robin, but Robin's got second billing. So again, it's Batman and Robin. So I think that, she was used that way. But again, as it's been said, we have to remember where society was at that time period. And obviously our material, our entertainment, reflects where society is at a particular given time in a decade. So again, coming out of the 50s into the 60s, the 50s was women stayed at home and took care of the children and prepared the meals, and the men went out and killed the boars. No, the men went out and they had jobs, and they were supposed to bring home the bacon and all this, like Donna Reed and Father Knows Best. And it was all this kind of established material that said women would be second on the billing. And the 60s, you had not only the civil rights movement, but you had women's liberation, and you had awareness of different lifestyles, and all this was starting to erupt in the 60s. So for a while, Legia really reflected the mindset of 10 to 20 years prior in terms of the creation. I think now, like with the image I showed of Magnus a little while ago in terms of that costume, a character coming out looking like this now might be considered a prime character to represent, a gay character or something like that. There's all kinds of possibilities because of where society is sitting at this moment in space and time. And would be curious to see what would happen if somebody reboots the character again. Reboot not being a pun intended.
Right. Yeah. We know there were very few really dynamic women characters in the comics. And at one point I had occasion to read a whole bunch of 1960s and 70s, early 70s Wonder Woman. And I was really surprised by how often Wonder Woman had to be saved by Steve Trevor. The only woman who did not, that I saw in the survey of, and I was reading some Marvel and some DC at that period, who didn't require periodic rescues by her male companions was Rita Farr, Elastigirl of the Doom Patrol, which is another one that I bought sporadically with my allowance. But
you made that money really stretch.
Yeah, I did. I mean, I didn't buy sodas or bubble gum or anything like that. I go down and see what's new on the spinner rack this week, and I could get 2. And if I only got 1 last week, then I could get 3. So, ration out that little, and the allowance did increase over the years, but you have to remember I was 8 years old a long time ago. So 25 cents didn't sound as paltry then as it does now. Either of you want to add anything before we move on?
No, I'd say we've pretty much covered that one.
Okay. What did you think of the setting in that all of North America is one city? Do you see things going that way? Or, when you look back on it as an adult, does that seem reasonable to you? Or do you think that's not as likely? Alex, will you start?
Yeah, I'll try and keep this short. I can see something like that happening in certain places on this planet, not necessarily here. I don't necessarily see America and Canada merging into one entity. I do think that the way things are going right now, again, I say how society influences the media and vice versa. There's more divisiveness going on now, so it's a little hard to envision, people all coming together, at this point. But I would like to think that depending on how we move forward, there's a possibility that certain countries would meld together for economic reasons, and that's a possibility. And there's even a science fiction story that I did where the hemispheres divided up differently because of another reason, which I won't go into. But so it's possible, but I don't really see North America happening that way. I mean, it just could be a limitation of my imagination at this point.
Okay. Fraser?
It was a pretty typical, not a common one necessarily, but a common idea that we get more population. And just as we had been slowly paving over more and more of a country, we'd pave over everything. Even as late as the Paul Levitz, Keith Giffen Legion of Superheroes era, they referenced, I think it was like New York and Boston, and all the Northeast were one gigantic megalopolis. So it was a common idea. I don't see it happening now. We take the environment a lot more serious. Well, a lot of us take the environment a lot more seriously. There is more conscious effort not to simply spread out and sprawl over everything. I think it is unlikely, maybe in some parts of the world where they're developing more aggressively, but I don't see one ginormous NORAM.
We talked about Legia, and I'd like to kind of circle around to the other women characters in the series who seem to do other things and have more agency. Do you have one in particular that worked really well for you or didn't work very well for you? Fraser, will you start?
Okay, it's been a while since I read V2. They started to add a number of supporting characters in the second, what's collected in the second volume. People who admired Magnus and were trying to be more like him and independent. And if I remember correctly, a woman psychic who was a very cool character and if I'm again remembering correctly, communicated with beasts. She was the one who stuck out. She was the only other one who stuck out at me.
Okay. Alex?
Actually, no, I don't. I think again, the most time that I spent with the series was really with the Russ Manning series, and I sort of dabbled or popped in every now and then to look at what Valiant and some of the others did, and they sort of lost me because of, again, for me, there was a sort of adventurous, as I said, fresh sort of look at the future and the possibilities of this and this dynamic hero when the series was first introduced. And so that was what pulled me in. As I got older, and again, other publishing houses sort of took their turn with Magnus, I found that a lot of the storytelling was inconsistent, and so it didn't really hold my interest. So I would say no. I can't really think of any of the female characters that stood out. Again, maybe because I wasn't as exposed to them as much as Fraser or you.
Well, I didn't have very many of the Magnus issues because I tended to buy Superman and Batman and the Justice League of America and the Legion of Superheroes first. And then if I had money left over, I might buy Magnus or one of the other books that I liked. But the animal, they call them neo-animals, and her name was Dana with an E. I mean, I don't know how you pronounce it because I only saw it on the page. But she seemed to have more agency than any other female character in there, and she helped them solve a problem, unmask a crime wave. And then the woman who was in charge of undersea food production, Selena, was a nice change because up to this point, I hadn't seen any women do anything important. And if you're in charge of food production, well, that's kind of important. So in addition to actually using some women in more prominent roles than Legia had, there also began to be ethnic diversity creeping into the series as it went along. It wasn't so much in the original background of the series. That was a pretty white world in the first few issues. But then diversity began to sort of trickle in. There'd be a character here and a character there, but not a whole lot of characters until a certain point. Do you all have anything that you want to say to that? Alex, will you start?
Well, I grew up watching television and movies and reading books that were pretty sterile, in terms of diversity. I mean, I was born in the 50s, and subsequently, 99% of the hero figures that were presented to the world were Caucasian.
Yeah.
It affected me in one way, and going through the 60s, and again, the civil rights movement and women's rights and all of those things, people suddenly becoming aware, there's more to the world than I've been sort of programmed to recognize, had an effect on me. But it was, I felt like Gold Key and a couple of the other comic book companies really didn't reflect that the way Marvel did. And subsequently, even my allegiance to DC in terms of Batman and Superman sort of waned as Spider-Man and the Fantastic Four and Wyatt Wingfoot and the Black Panther and these characters started to emerge in the comic book world. That was where my attention went, and also because of the way that Marvel was telling stories at that time, where they were no longer set in imaginary cities that kind of looked sort of like maybe, but now it was in New York City, it was in Los Angeles. So the world was becoming more exciting to me. I feel that, again, Gold Key or the Magnus series really just sort of faithfully represented what was happening at that time, which was the world was presented to us on our television shows and in our reading material as a pretty much a white world. And it wasn't until somebody sort of insisted that there were blacks, or maybe we should treat Chinese and Japanese and Hispanics and Native Americans with a little bit more respect. It wasn't until that became a push that I began to see, as you said, you use the word creeping. I would say sort of, revelation, the emerging of some of these more respectful representation, or at least visual moments where we would see these characters. And I don't, again, with the Magnus series, the series that I followed was, like all the other things, was pretty white. It was maybe later with Valiant, and there was a brief moment with Dynamite where you might have seen, at least in the background, again, some more diversity. So again, the early stuff, no, I don't want to say that the early ones really weren't worth mentioning the diversity, because it was minuscule, if it there at all.
Okay. Fraser?
If they did add some diversity as they went along, that is cool for the time, because DC, as Alexander was pointing out, what it had much better women than Marvel, it stayed extremely white on into the early 70s. So, and for what I remember of most of the other companies, they pretty much stuck to a white cast as well. So if Russ Manning started to diversify, that is a plus, even if it's not much by today's standards. I do not remember that detail myself.
Well, I think the main reason I remember it is because I reviewed those compilations today. And so it's fresher in my memory than it would have been otherwise. And there were a bunch of young teenagers who were fans of Magnus and would occasionally involve themselves in his adventures. And one of those kids was black, and one appeared to be Asian. And in one of the later issues in the compilations, an American Indian girl joined their club. And so that was interesting, because looking back on it and comparing it, as you say, things were very, very white. I remember when it was a very big deal that Diane Carroll headlined the show Julia.
Yep.
As a single mother, black nurse professional. And that got headlines because it was so different from what had been the case. And then there was a later story in the ones that I read where one of the series villains, and I'm blanking on which one right now, was using sorcery to affect the world and to cast illusions and to hinder Magnus in his fighting. And this young woman who had joined, well, really a girl, she's a teenage girl, who joined the Outsiders, was a Blackfoot. And so the Blackfoot had aerial gardens in New York. And that became important because this sorcerer was affecting the food supply to sap people's will to resist. And so the Blackfoot used their food to replace the ensorcelled food. They called it sorcered food, which would be really hard to say. You can write that, but saying that is a little bit of a challenge. And helped Magnus combat their sorcery. And that's actually one of my favorite stories because it introduces cultural elements that are different from what we saw in pretty much every issue. Mm-hmm. And I like the fact that we had reading it now. I don't remember that story from when I was reading them back in the day. But reading that now, I thought, well, it's a little stereotypical because harmony with the earth, and people tend to stereotype indigenous peoples that way. But they played a big role in the story. It wasn't just go hold this window open while Magnus sneaks out. They did something that was really important and pivotal to the story. And I liked that about it. Thinking back on what you remember, and I'm kind of cheating a little because I think I owned like 3 or 4 issues. And until I read these compilations, I didn't have a wide range of stories that I would have cited. But of the stories that you remember, do you have a favorite?
Wow. No, I don't. It's funny. Again, one of the things that was most appealing to me was the visual. The overall concept of fighting robots when they were evil or being used for evil purposes, and again, the future, that was fun and that was exciting and titillating. But it was the visuals that really pulled me into that series because in some ways, the stories were, I don't want to say repetitious, but there wasn't a lot of uniqueness about certain stories. And like the one that you mentioned sort of stands out because, again, yes, you brought in the fact that there are other kinds of people in this world who live a different kind of life and are integral to health and well-being, which the technology was kind of ignoring, or the people being served by technology were becoming oblivious to. And so it's bringing us back to a certain sort of harmonious, or at least to some sort of realization that we can't depend on technology entirely. So that in and of itself is a really thick story. And I think that has a lot to offer. But I don't recall that there were a lot of stories like that.
Fraser?
There's nothing in particular that sticks out as a favorite. I didn't find them too repetitious. I think Manning did a good job, and his collaborators, on working variations on the theme and the basic concept. I like the fact that as we get into the second trade paperback, he's working more variation, introducing more characters, different ideas, and expanding out. So I think it was improving as it went along. But beyond that, no particular favorites.
Okay. And I meant to mention there's a story that takes place in the Himalayas as well. Himalayan prince comes to New York to get Magnus's help with a problem that they're having, and then most of the story takes place there.
I would also mention that, Russ, if I remember right, he only really had an opportunity to do like 20 some odd issues, wasn't it? It's like 21 or 24 issues. I started to say episodes.
Episodes, yeah. I'm not sure. Because, with a lot of his work, when I went online to prepare for this panel, the introduction that Mike Royer, who was an inker for Jack Kirby, wrote to the first compilation, mentioned that Gold Key broke with tradition in allowing Russ Manning to put his name on the book, because that was still the period where creators weren't credited. Mm-hmm. And so that was unusual that he would be able to do that. And it makes it hard to find things people have done, because when I went into Comics Find, which is usually a pretty good source for what people have done, it offered me Magnus and Tarzan for Russ Manning, and that's it. The Google offered me much more, but, and a lot of it is compilations from Dark Horse, actually, or that probably out of print now, but that was on the Dark Horse website. So,
Well,
did
from what
did I
here,
respond to what you said, or did I stray from the point?
no, I think you did fine. I was just going to say that, what I noticed here, it says that Russ Manning was a writer artist on this. 1963 was when the book first was published by Gold Key, and it says here, 1963, published by Gold Key in February of 63, and it seems to intimate that there were only a certain number of issues. So I think it's kind of, maybe a little bit more research would help. I'll have to try and do that.
Well, there are listed on the Comics Find page.
Oh, here it is. 21. It says the series was popular in the 1960s. As the 70s approached, sales declined. However, Manning only completed 21 issues. The rest were reprints of previous issues or new stories by others.
Okay, well, thank you for finding that.
Yeah, now, and that's one source.
Well, but that makes sense that Dark Horse only has a 3-volume compilation, each of which has about 7 stories in it. And I wasn't looking at the names on the covers when I was looking to see how many issues there were, so I'm glad that you picked up on that. Russ Manning, the foreword to the first compilation says that Manning also worked with and learned from Alex Raymond. When I was growing up, there was a daily strip in our newspaper, and I can't remember the name of it, but it was a private eye strip that was drawn by Alex Raymond. And I remember liking that a lot. At least I think
Kirby, something like that.
Yes, I think that is what it was. But I really liked Manning's art. I mean, that was a big appeal of the book for me. And when I look back at it today, I thought I think one reason I liked the Magic story is that it wasn't just Magnus smashes the robot of the week. Because there was a lot of that, or of the month. So, one of the things that we said before we started that we wanted to talk about was, if you were to do a new version of Magnus, what would you do with the character? And Alex, since you brought that up, why don't you start?
It's interesting because I think it's one of those situations, almost like a Jules Verne scenario, where Russ tapped into something, a theme, if you will, that was very almost prophetic. It's almost like 1984, because we're talking 1963, and I mentioned some of the scientific achievements that were being introduced at that time. It was hard for general public to think of robots as a threat. I mean, I watched the Jetsons and things like that, and a car that you could park and then fold up into an attaché case and walk into your office with. That seemed pretty cool. And having an automated home seemed pretty cool. So for Russ to come up with this concept and whatever inspired it, to where we become dependent on machines, and then if machines develop some sort of sentient thought process, they could become a threat themselves. I think building off of that, we are in a position now where society is even closer to that sort of scenario. You mentioned a little while ago about AI. There's a lot of concerned individuals right now not sure if they're going to lose their jobs and things like that, because this artificial intelligence, theoretically, in certain ways, could take over massive amounts of the work they do, or the job in its entirety. I think the other thing, too, is AI, as it's presented to us, is learning. So you've got HAL from 2001, A Space Odyssey. You've got all these potential scenarios. And we've also have a more, shall we say, a more concise understanding of how corporations work and other sort of potential threats. So I would really love to use the character to explore that and where our society's mindset is now. I think going into the characters a bit more, not just Magnus and his entourage, but the people that he would meet in these adventures, those characters, getting more going a little bit more into the levels of their lives and what that society is like. And is there a social ladder? Are there people on top, obviously, who are well off, but what about the infrastructure? And what about other planets? And so I would really, I would enjoy using that character to explore society and technology where we are now and how we think now and how we feel now, and even some of the divisiveness that's going on now. I would use that character to explore that while definitely having some sci-fi thrills and adventure.
Okay. Fraser, what about you?
I think looking at Silicon Valley today, an awful lot of their interest does not seem to be in creating a nice utopian future where robots handle all the grungy work for us. So I would probably envision Magnus's future as one where the tech bros are in charge and life is robotic and great for them. And a lot of the rest of us are in a mess of a place and really having to struggle, and then throwing Magnus into that. Where it would go from there, I don't know. But yes, definitely still some robot smashing and weird plots and villains like Dr. Zirkle, who is the one I remember most. But yeah, definitely some class warfare aspects to it.
And I also think, you mentioned,
No, go ahead.
Women. And I think, again, where our heads are now, there would be more diversity in terms of gender and lifestyles and things like that as well. So I think there's a much more richer stew to work from now than Russ had at that point in his life.
Well, the benefits or detriments of technology pop up in science fiction a lot. There's the earbuds and the giant TV screens in Fahrenheit 451. There's the hostility toward the androids in the Caves of Steel. There's, going back earlier, there's Colossus, the Forbin project, and the computer that takes over things. And then, of course, there's Terminator. So we could do a whole panel just on that. But I think if I were to do a new Nexus series, it would definitely focus on how much tech is too much tech, but there'd be some explosions. I mean, Nexus is kind of short on explosions. There's a lot of smashing, but it's not a lot of explosions. So I put some explosions in as well as the smashing. And I would certainly develop more female characters and more ethnically diverse and gender diverse characters in that world. But I'm looking at this and we have run through our time. So if you all will tell people where they can find information about you and your work, if you have a recent or upcoming project you'd like to highlight, please do that. Fraser, will you start?
My name is Fraser Sherman. You can find me at frasersherman.com, Fraser. My most recent book is 19 Infinity, a collection of historical fantasy short stories in the 20th century. Last year, I came out with a steampunk novel, Questionable Minds, and a book on alien visitors to Earth in the movies, The Aliens Are Here. I also blog about comic books over at the Atomic Junk Shop website.
Okay. Alex?
Hi, again, Alex Simmons. You can find me Simmons Here and Now. It's my website. You can also find me on Instagram at Alex Simmons Says. My most recent work that's on the public counter at this point is I have one of the short stories in the Black Panther Tales of Wakanda anthology series that came out last year. And I am also writing some of the afterwards in a series of Asterix collections that are being put out by paper, although I think there's a new publisher involved. And I have a number of projects on the table right now, which I am very much looking forward to working on over the next 2 weeks of my vacation. So I'll check in with you later and let you know how all that goes.
Please do. And so you can find me here at ConTinual a lot or at nancynorthcott.com on social media. I'm most active on Twitter or whatever it's called this week, where I'm at Nancy Northcott. I am on Instagram, just not very much. And my latest release is the third book in the Boar King's Honor historical fantasy trilogy. It's set during the summer of 1940, opens with the Dunkirk evacuation and ends during the early days of the Blitz. And it's about British wizards trying to stop Operation Sea Lion, the German invasion of Britain. Well, yes, Alex.
Got one thing. Bad. I keep forgetting to mention my podcast, Tell the Damn Story. Find on Apple and on Spotify. Tell the Damn Story.
Okay. I'd like to thank you both for joining this discussion. It's been a lot of fun for me. I hope it has been for you. And thank you to everyone who's watching it. And thank you to our sponsors, Heroes Aren't Hard to Find and Heroes Convention.